Hey everyone! So I mentioned in my last video that I made a mistake with the most visible jurors who didn't make it to the end game, and that involved Julia. For some reason, I thought she was 7th instead of 6th, so I removed her from the list, and here is the list of who would actually be the most visible jurors who didn't make it to the end game. So the main difference is Julia is taken out, and after Libra, who started the video, there is a tie between Howie from Big Brother 7 and Catherine from Big Brother 21, both with a diary room average of 3.26. This makes sense because while they had a bit of humor, they weren't really given much focus during their runs. And now this is a list of the honorable mentions, and these are the people who just missed out on the top 20 least visible endgamers. So there's some representation from earlier seasons, quite a bit actually, and of course some from the more recent seasons. These choices make sense to me, at least. So at 20th is Brett from Big Brother 20, who has a diary room average of 3.37. I'm kind of shocked he ended up on this list, especially with how some people in the fan base hyped the heck out of him as being the funniest thing ever, but he wasn't very visible. Maybe it was because Tyler took all the diary rooms from that side of the house, and when it was just level 6 essentially, Brett was booted in the quick double eviction. In reality, he never did a whole lot that would justify a huge amount of screen time, but I thought he would have gotten more screen time anyways. He also won only one veto competition and didn't have many interesting interactions after Winston was booted very early on in the season. At 19th is Gina Marie from Big Brother 15, who has a diary room average of 3.36. This placement really is not shocking to me. While Gina Marie did get into her fair share of drama, it was always overshadowed by some other drama by a more important house guest, or she and a bunch of others are fighting with one person, but that other person she is with gets the more focused narration. She wasn't strategic whatsoever throughout the season, was not a good speaker, hence her not getting a lot of diary rooms, and was not relevant to the main dynamics of the season until the very end. They would give her more screen time when she won HOH, but even then she was overshadowed in her first HOH, and when they wanted/needed to make fun of her. At 18th is Christine from Big Brother 16, who has a diary room average of 3.35. It isn't shocking that in a season that has been considered to be misogynistic, has a female endgamer make it onto the least visible endgamers list. Christine was brought into the alliance very early on, but she was rarely given any sort of coverage, since they were more strategic and more endearing, at least to production and certain casuals, that warranted more screen time compared to her. She only started getting content when she won her sole HOH and ended up backstabbing Nicole, and then the edit focused on her and Cody's flirtation throughout the season. Her lackluster edit makes sense to me. At 17th is Angela from Big Brother 20, who has a diary room average of 3.34. I think this position makes sense for Angela, what she contributed to the season, and how I remembered her screen time on the season. People were calling her furniture online because she was such a non-presence for the first half of the season. We first really saw her when she won her first HOH competition and was told by Tyler to target Bailey. They tried to give her somewhat of a villain edit, but she couldn't own it and she was too cowardly to pull it off. After that, she got into a showmatch with Tyler and most of her screen time was given to that, though it was clear that she was not Tyler's number one strategically, hence why Casey isn't on the list, but Angela is. At number 16th is Natalie from Big Brother 11, who has a diary room average of 3.3. For some reason, I was not expecting her to be on the list, since I always felt like she had a presence from the beginning of the season to the end of the seasons. But looking into her content and how it was distributed, it made sense as to how she ended up on here. For the first half of the season, Jesse got more of the content and Russell when he was on their side, and after the second half, she was overshadowed by Kevin completely. Even when she was nominated a lot in the middle of the season, she was not given an underdog edit, and I think her lack of competition wins contributed as to why she was less visible. So we have a tie for 15th and 14th place between Natalie from Big Brother 18 and Samantha from Big Brother 20, both having a diary room average of 3.24. I really wasn't expecting Natalie to be on this list, since she had her showmance with James and was one of the more promising newbies in the season. But the fact that she was a newbie on a mixed season shows why she's on here anyways. She nor James were that involved in the strategy of the season, and they would always go to James for coverage. Now that I'm really thinking about it, I do remember that her diary rooms were painfully scripted, like more than usual, so there could have been a conflict there pertaining her diary rooms, which might explain why she got less screen time and why production didn't use her as much. Samantha is not surprising to me, since outside of her first week, where she was nominated and was forced to be in a costume for half the week, she was not relevant to the happenings of the rest of the season. Even in the week where she won HOH, she was overshadowed by others and didn't get much screen time. As the season went on and on, it became clear that she was struggling in the house, tried to quit several times, and was on the verge of a mental breakdown. Since this was a modern season and not an earlier Big Brother season, they didn't even make this into a captivating storyline, but they just chose to under-edit her overall. It also doesn't help when she wasn't in Alliance and wasn't really a floater either. So at 13th is Memphis from Big Brother 22, who has a diary room average of 3.16. I already delved into him and his lack of visibility in another video, so no need to delve into it again here. At 12th is Zach from Big Brother 8, who has a diary room average of 3.13. So not shocked with this placement, and it makes total sense. He comes off as way too awkward on screen, so I see why he did not get a lot of diary rooms throughout the season. Despite making it third, he was not involved in the main dynamics of the season for like 75% of the season, as he was never nominated and never won a competition until later on in the season. And when he did get involved at the end, he had this inflated ego and thought he controlled a lot more events than he did during the season. The house gets paid him dust, so the edit did as well. At 11th is Joe from Big Brother 14, who has a diary room average of 3.08. Another spot that isn't surprising for various reasons. One of them is that this was a mixed season where the veterans are of course going to get a lot more screen time over the newbies. Another one is that he was not relevant to the dynamics of the season, whether it involved drama, relationships with the house guests, or strategically. And another reason is that he was horrendous in the diary rooms, as he was given overtly obnoxious diary rooms, which even production realized were horrible. In general, he was not really relevant, and with so much going on, it was not worth showing him a lot. At 10th place is Corey from Big Brother 18, who has a diary room average of 2.9. I was fully expecting him to make it on this list, for several of the same reasons I discussed pertaining other newbies in mixed seasons. The veterans are always going to get more screen time, and he was in a showmance with Nicole, who was always going to get more screen time and relevance on the show. Outside of that, he was a follower the entire season, whether it was with Nicole or Polly, so he wasn't heavily relevant in the dynamics of the season. He did win a few competitions, so I will give him credit there. Also, he was one of the most boring people to ever be cast in BB, so his little screen time makes sense. And even with his little screen time, they created this false persona of him being obsessed with Christmas, when apparently that wasn't even his favorite holiday. It was just weird. So there was a two-way tie for 9th and 8th place between Renny from Big Brother 10 and Ollie from Big Brother 21, both having a diary room average of 2.88. I find this ranking to be relatively interesting, since one thing that Renny isn't is boring, and she's one of the most unique casting choices on the show ever. I also think that because there are so many other polarizing people on the season who are also more relevant in the dynamics of the season, she got overshadowed, and it doesn't help that she was aligned with Keisha and Dan, who would always get more attention. Renny was just not strategic throughout the season, so outside of them using her for laughs, she was never going to warrant a lot of screen time, and she was only nominated twice and won HOH 1, so that was another avenue for missed screen time. Holly being on here kind of makes sense, though she was never really that invisible if I remembered correctly. She was in the 8 alliance, which turned into an alliance of 6 a few weeks into the season, and there are bigger personalities like Christy, Jack, Jackson, and Nick than her for several reasons. And then she got into an alliance with Jackson, Nicole, and Cliff for the second half of the season, all of them who would obviously get more screen time than her. And while she did start to win more competitions in the second half of the season, Jackson started to become the narrator and the one to beat, so people in the edit and production started ignoring her more in general. At 7th is Hannah from Big Brother 23, who has a diary room average of 2.84. This placement doesn't shock me whatsoever. When there's an alliance that is so focused on a goal that is completely separate from the game, it creates a dynamic where there are underdogs that get a lot of screen time and people within that power structure who get a lot of screen time. Hannah was not a mastermind or driving the strategy or competitions like Kyland, Tiffany, or Xavier were, and she didn't have as much personality as Asa or Derek F were to be used as comedic relief. She also was not seen as an underdog like Derek X, Claire, or arguably even Alyssa. It also doesn't help that her sole HOH was in a double eviction, and she was evicted in another double eviction. In the eyes of production, she clearly just didn't stand out much at all. At 6th is Victoria from Big Brother 16, who has a diary room average of 2.79. Not shocked whatsoever, though I expected her to be a bit higher on the list, but I guess there's an element of her that people could consider to be comedic. Anyways, in a season that was heavily male-centric, that put her at a huge disadvantage. She also was not seen as an underdog akin to a Nicole or a Donnie, and Victoria was completely irrelevant to the dynamics of the season. She was nominated a bunch of times as a pawn, but she thought that she and Derek were actual allies, and Victoria was just there. It makes complete sense as to why she didn't get much screen time. At 5th is Jenn from Big Brother 14, who has a diary room average of 2.78. You would think that someone who looked like Jenn would be given a very large edit because of her explosive personality and seemingly more unique than many of the other BB House guests that were cast before and after her. But she managed to be one of the most invisible endgamers in BB history, and that's for a few reasons. One is of course her being a newbie in a mixed season, where the veterans are of course going to get more screen time. Another reason is that she was not involved in the dynamics of the season whatsoever, and was really on her own throughout the entire season. She also was not funny or interesting on the show, and she was just too under the radar the entire time. At 4th is Ollie from Big Brother 10, who has a diary room average of 2.57. I feel like this spot is very fitting for Ollie and his overall contributions towards the season. We of course saw him get into a showmance with April from very early on, and he was the one who started to turn the tide against Brian in the first week. But he was pretty much a non-factor until his final week, where he almost wins HOH, but gives it to Dan due to a shady deal, and he flips out when it was broken. He did nothing noteworthy outside of that, as April and even Keisha and Libra got more narration, and his downfall took place in a quick double eviction, so they can even stretch that out for a week to get more visibility. The bronze prize of 3rd place goes to Beau from Big Brother 6, who has a diary room average of 2.54. This is another position that I was not shocked by whatsoever. BB5 was the first season where the distribution and edit became a lot more lopsided, and BB6 continued that trajectory. Beau was the more normal and neutral person in this alliance, so his screen time and diary rooms were extremely limited, partially due to that. Beau's only notable moment in the season was his fight with Janelle, which happened in the mix of a bunch of other fights that happened in the exact same episode. His HOH was in a short double eviction, and his eviction was also in a short double eviction, so the moments that could have gotten him more visibility under a normal week were not available to him. The silver prize of second place goes to Kevin from Big Brother 19, who has a diary room average of 2.38. For some reason, I wasn't expecting him to be this low on the list. Or is it too high on the list? You all get what I mean anyways. It makes sense as to why he wasn't very visible, despite being a relatively unique casting choice. Kevin was not really in the majority alliance, but he was kept around because he was a relatively useless player in the house. He didn't win any competitions, and he was only nominated in the later weeks when all the other outsiders were given the boot. He never said anything insightful either, and while he got into a bit of drama in the later weeks, it wasn't narrated by him. It also doesn't help that most of the other Endgamers were train wrecks, so they didn't need him for that type of footage either. So, the gold prize for first place goes to Julia from Big Brother 17, who has a diary room average of 2.36. So, like I mentioned earlier, I already went into depth about her lack of visibility 2 BB videos ago, so I guess it doesn't really make sense for me to delve into it here. I really shouldn't have effed up as much as I had, but at least it was corrected. Her being the least visible endgamer kinda does make sense, especially since she wasn't really a player for most of the pre-jury anyways, and while she was given several weeks to really become her own character and house guest, she didn't take advantage of it. So not only is that my list of the least visible endgamers, but the most visible and least visible endgamers in general, and who are the most visible pre-jurors, jurors, and the least visible pre-jurors and jurors. I might make a video about the gender distributions of the diary rooms based off of averages and maybe amounts in the future, or maybe I just will move on from this. Anyways, it was interesting going over all of this, and thank you all for following along.